Welcome to this rapid revision session on segregation, the Jim Crow laws. This will aim to provide a very brief introduction to the nature of segregation in the American South. Firstly, Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know includes segregation, which means separating people. The Deep South. This is a name given to the states of the USA in the South most associated with slavery and racism. And Jim Crow. This was originally a racist music act where a white performer would wear black makeup and mock black people. And lastly, therefore, the Jim Crow laws was the name given to the segregation laws in the Deep South, named after that racist act. So a bit of context first of all. Where did this come from? Plessy versus Ferguson. In 1896, the highest court in the USA, the Supreme Court, ruled in the Plessy versus Ferguson case that segregation was legal and did not go against the US Constitution, the list of main rules and laws that they have to follow. Now, I could go into this case in a little bit more detail, but it really isn't necessary. You can look it up yourself if you like. But remember that racism was deeply entrenched into American society at this time. This was only about 30 years after slavery had ended. Segregation, after this ruling, was considered legal as long as the treatment of black people was separate but equal. That meant that their rights supposedly hadn't been infringed under the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection under the laws. Obviously, this is nonsense, but that was what they ruled. Clearly, the Jim Crow laws kept people separate, but they did not treat people equally. And we're going to see some examples of that in a moment. So, Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a stereotypical and offensive American music hall act. In it, a white performer would put on black makeup and would sing songs that stereotyped black people as stupid, rude and uncivilized. These acts were very popular with white people and they gave their name to the Jim Crow laws. Here's one of the most famous examples that people tend to point to. Drinking fountains, although actually this would only be a very small part of everyone's everyday life. Here's a sign taken from a public conveniences in Montgomery, Alabama. You can see that it's dated the 14th of July 1931. And there is an example of segregated drinking fountains. You can notice that the facilities are both provided, but they're definitely not both equal. Let's consider from this photograph, how would this form of segregation make people feel? That becomes important when we come to Brown versus Board of Education. Here we can see a sign on a bus seat that says for coloured patrons only. Now that sign could be moved so that if more white people got on, some of the black people sat behind that sign might be asked to stand up and the sign would be moved back. That happened in the case of Rosa Parks in the Montgomery bus boycott, and there'll be a future lesson on that some other time. This is a sign on a laundrette in the 1950s. White only, maids in uniform accepted. Now that's quite telling. It means that although this was a whites only laundry, if you had hired black help as it would be called, they were allowed to go in there because after all they were helping their white families. It shows the hypocrisy of the system as well as its racism. What about this one then? This is a protest outside a diner. They're protesting segregation in there. This is somewhat earlier than the later sit-in movement, but it's got similar origins. What about this one then? This is a school. It appears to be an engaging lesson, well resourced, the pupils are all paying attention, but it is still segregated. Many black schools had smaller budgets and second-hand books and resources compared to white schools in the same areas, and yet others, like this one, appear to be equally well equipped. Therefore, state legislatures could point to this and say, this is an example of separate but equal. The task was to prove that this was not the case. And when we consider the inquiry, how would this form of segregation make people feel, it becomes quite revealing. If by segregating children in education, even with similar or identical resources, it might make them feel inferior to their white counterparts. And if that happens, that is not equal. This was the basis of the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954, which we'll look at in a future video. Some final points then. In many parts of the USA, especially in the Deep South, life was segregated. The laws in question were known as the Jim Crow laws after a racist music act. And the court case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 established the precedent of separate but equal. Segregation was separate, but it was anything but equal. I hope that's been a useful presentation for you. There will be more on this topic very soon. And if you did find it useful, subscribe to the channel and there'll be more rapid revision sessions coming soon. Thanks very much for watching.